Keir Starmer there in Downing Street. I suppose the expression is falling on his sword. He said there he'd been asked, or he'd heard the question being asked by his party as to whether he was best placed to lead the party into the future, and that he'd heard the answer from the party. So he set out there his timetable for resignation. He will be gone by the end of the summer. He says he hopes, assuming there's some kind of contest, and that the new leader will be in place by September. Well, with me here on set is Doug Herbert, our international affairs commentator, and also Clovis Casale, who's followed British politics for many years for us here at France 24. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Doug, let's start off with you. I mean, falling on his sword, I suppose, is there, especially a very emotional Keir Starmer there, notably at the end, when he talked about his family as well.
Yeah, you know, in these times, I think it bears mentioning that it takes a certain measure of political integrity to simply acknowledge and listen to the voices of those who appeal to you to step aside. I know that I default to Donald Trump a lot, but I couldn't help but think, you know, could you imagine the U.S. president in a similar situation, being signaled by the leaders of his party, you know, it's perhaps time to step aside, and him actually doing it. But in a nutshell, yeah, he fell on his own sword. He did it with integrity. And in a weird way, what's funny is 4 years ago when Boris Johnson stood down, you couldn't think of two more politically different odd partners, you know, Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer. But what was reflected, the tone of both of their speeches, is that at the end of the day, they said they heard the voice and the will of their parties, and even if they reluctantly were leaving, they decided it was in the best interests of the country. And in Boris Johnson's case, you might remember the memorable line when he stood right in that very same podium, saying no one is indispensable. So Keir Starmer basically did something that is not can't be taken for granted anymore in this particular political age, and that is he put his personal interests aside, yes, under enormous pressure from those around him in his party and Parliament. You could say, well, he had no choice but to leave, but he did it in a dignified way. So he bowed out, as you would say, gracefully.
Also joining us from Downing Street is our correspondent Benedict Pavio, who's there for us. Benedict, give us a bit of a sense of the atmosphere and the emotions there, I suppose, in Downing Street.
Well, we waited a long time, and it was a composed, at first, Prime Minister who came out. Very noticeable, he came out with his wife, Lady Victoria. I remember when David Cameron did that, and when he announced he was resigning. So it was clear from the word go as they came out that he was indeed resigning, because we weren't even clear on that. The fact that he said he was doing it with good grace, that he'd heard the message clearly of his party. And of course, that realization came during the week, because you'll remember that on Friday he was a combative Prime Minister who was anxious to underline there was no leadership challenge. Of course, what has changed is the collapse of the support in Cabinet for him. Cabinets are generally held on a Tuesday morning. It was impossible, and that's why we were all here this morning, it was impossible to believe that he could try and act as normal and not make an important statement, setting out some sort of decision, either continuing to fight or coming to the realization, as he has, that he needs to stand down. So he's given us a timetable. He has a duty of care, clearly, which he's very aware of. He came out to applause from his staff. It is traditional that staff from number 10 and 11 will come out when there are these resignations. He got huge applause as soon as he had finished his statement. And of course, noticeable that his voice cracked several times. Now, let me be completely honest with you. The moment he started his speech, and this is classic British freedom of speech, just outside the gates of Downing Street, a protester who's been shouting for about an hour about Starmer out, started to play very loud music, which is amplified by some sort of electronic system. We could actually barely hear him here in the street. But I saw that his voice cracked, that he looked very moved, and indeed when Lady Victoria walked over to him to hug him, to great applause from the number 10 and 11 staff, she clearly wiped a tear from her eye. So, of course, it's a very dignified goodbye, not an immediate goodbye, since we now have a timetable. Meanwhile, his biggest rival, before that leadership contest begins in earnest, is actually Andy Burnham, who's on a train making his way down to Westminster, to London, here in central London, to Parliament, where he will be sworn in this afternoon as a Member of Parliament, having trounced Nigel Farage's Reform UK party by 9,000, well, the candidate for Reform UK in the Thursday election, and showing his party, the Labour Party, that he is capable of completely dumbfounding the polls and actually beating, very trouncing even, the Reform UK party, which is quite a feat, since that very same constituency during the local elections only on the 6th of May had actually helped to get Reform UK party get the highest score. So a turbulent time. Here we are, 24 hours before a 10-year anniversary of Brexit, and yet another Prime Minister on his way out soon. And he spoke to the King this morning, which is the way things are done here. And of course, the King must be held at all times in close communication with the Prime Minister of the day. And it was unthinkable that he wouldn't do that. So he has done that. But he remains Prime Minister for the moment. Of course, we'll see what happens, because there will be paralysis as far as government policy is concerned here. And the markets, we wait to see their reaction as well.
Benedict, just before you go, I just want to ask you one more question. I mean, you've been covering British politics for years, of course, there from London. I mean, the crucial question now, as far as the Labour Party is concerned, is there going to be any challenges? Are there going to be any challenges to Andy Burnham, or is this effectively now going to be a coronation, do you think?
It could be a coronation. It's not clear yet. We'll see what Andy Burnham finally, we hope, will make a statement and give some indication later on today. It's possible. We know that Andy Burnham and Wes Streeting spoke at the beginning of last week, so before the election. We don't know if they've spoken since Andy Burnham, but it would seem likely that they have. And will, for example, Wes Streeting, the former Health Secretary, who's made it absolutely crystal clear that he wishes to challenge for the leadership of the Labour Party and therefore for the keys to 10 Downing Street. But of course that was before the election. What we don't know is if the two men have come to some sort of agreement, and could Wes Streeting not go ahead with his leadership challenge in exchange for a prominent ministerial post in a future Burnham government. That is a real possibility. Will others try and get what is required at the moment is 81 sitting MPs, Labour MPs, to back you? Could, for example, the former Armed Forces Minister, Al Cairns, could the former Defence Minister, who also resigned, John Healey, could he put his hat in the ring? Or indeed, could others that we don't know about put their hats in the ring? Anything is possible. Clearly, what Keir Starmer was referring to is an orderly election, a transition. He is very mindful not to really bring chaos and to try and do an orderly transition. So a lot of unknowns, perhaps more clarity. The clarity we have now, as we speak, is that Keir Starmer remains Prime Minister, but basically has given intention of his resignation and is staying on to oversee that national executive of the Labour Party to decide in an orderly fashion how and when that transition will be done. And it is likely that that future successor would be in place, I think, is the goal, by what is an annual party conference, and that's right at the end of September. So I would imagine that that would be when that would happen. But will we see a coronation or a single candidate and a transition with Andy Burnham? It's probably quite likely, but we need him, say, people in the party, to flesh out his ideas. We only know that he wants to nationalise utilities like electricity and water. It is not clear what Burnhamism, which we're going to all have to learn to say, and real Manchesterism will really signify, and whether he will feel that he must abide by the manifesto on which almost 2 years ago, this same Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, walked up the street, having had what was at the time called a landslide victory. But in fact, it turns out it was a loveless election, and it was really a rejection of the Conservatives. And that has been part of the problem. When you have a big majority, it's much harder to keep them under control. And that is something that whoever succeeds Keir Starmer, whether it's Andy Burnham or somebody else, will have the very same problem.
Benedict, thanks very much. Benedict Pavé, our correspondent, joining us there from Downing Street. Well, let's come back to the studio. As I said, Doug Herbert, our international affairs commentator, is with me, and Clovis Casali, who's covered politics for many years from the UK for us. Clovis, I'm going to come to you now. I mean, I know you're just back, in fact, a couple of weeks ago from the UK, where you were filming a report, revisited, in fact, on Brexit and the implications of that 10 years on. I mean, talking to people as you did at that point, I mean, did you get a bit of a sense of their feelings and their thoughts and their opinions of Keir Starmer at the time? Because it was only about a month ago, wasn't it?
Absolutely. There was clear disappointment, for sure. People telling us that Keir Starmer had not delivered the change they were hoping for. Benedict was just mentioning that landslide victory that brought Keir Starmer and Labour into power. There was a lot of expectations. There was a lot of hope. And a lot of people felt disillusioned by what Keir Starmer basically did with the pension reform, with various measures not carrying out that very much needed change. People are suffering in the UK of high prices, of low quality of life in some parts of the country, with low purchasing power. For that report, we went to Lincolnshire, we went to London also, and a lot of people there were telling us something needs to change. And that's why, if it is Andy Burnham who takes over as Prime Minister, we'll have to wait and see for that, if there's a leadership contest or not, if Wes Streeting, the former Health Secretary, decides to join the battle or not. Well, if it is Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, who's just been elected MP for Macclesfield, well, he will need to show that he is not disconnected from the people, that he knows, the so-called King of the North, as people call him there, that he knows what people want and need, and that he can deliver that much-needed change.
I mean, King of the North sounds good if you're in the North, of course. If you're in the South, perhaps it doesn't sound quite so good. I mean, there's a real difference, is there, between that kind of Keir Starmer figure, who's perhaps much more of a Westminster-type figure, and someone like Andy Burnham. And getting that balance right between the two is going to be very difficult.
Possibly, but we were mentioning that report we did with Laurent Dupuis on the 10-year anniversary of Brexit. There we really saw the difference between London and the rest of the country. And there is a huge gap between London and other parts of the country, the North, but not only the North, the Midlands, other parts of the country. And there are a lot of people who feel that London is disconnected from the rest of the country. Andy Burnham, a few words on him. If he is to take over, he's a bit more left-wing than Keir Starmer. He's more outspoken. He comes across possibly as closer to the people. He doesn't always wear a shirt and a suit. He tries to talk in a blunt way, with his own accent, and that does count also in the UK, where there is a clear divide on the accent, depending on the class, depending on where you come from. And I think in the UK, people want that. A few words on possibly on Keir Starmer leaving 10 Downing Street. Extremely emotional in his final words, talking about his wife, his children, who supported him, because it has been very difficult in the last few months. Keir Starmer coming under fire also, and we'll be talking about it, I'm sure, over the appointment of Peter Mandelson, linked with Epstein. The media, a lot of people accusing Keir Starmer of not vetoing that nomination, of not doing enough to possibly investigate that nomination, or at least prevent that from happening. Also, Keir Starmer, when leaving 10 Downing Street, saying, look what we achieved in 2 years. We ended austerity, but that's clearly not what all the people in the UK think currently.
Well, let's go back to Doug Herbert, our international affairs commentator. So why does this matter, or does it matter internationally? I mean, Andy Burnham coming in instead of, assuming it is Andy Burnham coming in instead of Keir Starmer, I mean, will it actually make any difference to those policies which really affect international audiences?
Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's wait for the leadership contest, right? In politics, anything can happen. And next September is a relatively long time in politics. We've seen leadership contests be shaken up in ways we couldn't have predicted before. Look, Keir Starmer, the main thing that he didn't have going for him in this age is he was essentially an anti-populist. He came across as a very dour figure, very sober. The aphorism about him that made the rounds was he disappointed too many and persuaded too few. And polls, time and again, even from the very outset when his popularity was relatively higher, it couldn't get much lower right now than it has in recent days, even at the time we were already beginning to see signs of people beginning to question his very not his character, but his behavior, his whole being as a politician. People didn't question his integrity. They didn't question his basic decency or honesty. But the problem is that just doesn't fly right now on today's political stage. And one of the things that he was up against all the time, aside from the wars that he had to deal with, the war in Gaza, the war in Iran, he also was up against Trump, an extremely, I could say, irascible president, unpredictable. But he was at times looked like putty in Trump's hands. And he came across often in that famous now Oval Office meeting with Donald Trump as almost groveling when he handed him the invitation for the state visit from King Charles III. And it was this sort of very almost feeble-looking, unable to really punch back, to pull his own weight, a decent man, and just wasn't enough. What will it change? You have, perhaps for his supporters, they will say that this is a case of someone who in today's cutthroat, survival of the fittest type of populist political climate that we're seeing more and more of, with a few exceptions, a man of Keir Starmer's vintage, of his demeanor, just can't make it. And I would compare him, if you want another offhand comparison, a little bit. You heard him ticking off his list of achievements, right? Among them, ending austerity, cutting the NHS waiting lists, the biggest uptick in defense spending since the Cold War. All of these things, in perhaps another age and era, would be, checks in his column, good things. He was a bad communicator. He didn't sell his record enough to the people. And who does that sound like? You could say it sounds like Joe Biden a little bit, who kept saying repeatedly by his aides he had a great record, wasn't able to sell it to the people, wasn't able to communicate it by force of character or by simple force. He just didn't have the skills to get that message across.
You mentioned that phrase cutthroat there. I mean, I don't know how many, I've lost count, how many prime ministers there have been now in the UK over the last 5 to 10 years. But there's becoming a cycle, isn't there? Every couple of years it changes. And people are starting to say that the UK is becoming ungovernable just because of that pressure, just because of that constant niggling criticism of the Prime Minister.
And some are saying it's becoming like Italy, right? You know, the British always joking, not just the British, French, everyone used to joke that it was Italy that had, chronic serial turnover of prime ministers. You'd blink, you wouldn't know who was leading the country. And now, Italy looks, relatively stable by comparison to Britain, which, 6 or 7 prime ministers?
This will be the 7th prime minister in a decade.
In a decade.
And I just wanted to pick up on a point you were saying about Keir Starmer, his legacy. I think also we need to understand why the Labour backbenchers, MPs, decided to turn their back on Keir Starmer. It's also because in the polls, Labour is stagnating, is low, and Reform UK is higher than ever. Reform UK, far-right party, led by Nigel Farage, the face of Brexit. This is a party that, according to recent polls, is at 27% of the votes. Labour and Conservatives at 18%.
It's 27%, but every time an election comes up, they seem to lose it at the last minute, don't they?
Possibly, but it is still marking people's minds. It's very important. And that's also why Andy Burnham is in a strong position, because at the by-election in Macclesfield, he managed to get about 55% of the votes, 9,000 votes more than the Reform UK candidate. So he's also seen, with his style, with his policies maybe a bit more left-wing, as the man capable of defeating or preventing Reform UK of ever getting into power. And I think that's also one of the reasons why Labour MPs want Starmer out and possibly Burnham in.
And by the way, it's important, just picking up on him, picking up on me. It's, remember that the landslide victory that you mentioned at the top of the show, Stuart, he won on an anti-Tory vote, right? This was against Rishi Sunak. Everyone wanted the Tories out of there. This was not an effusive pro-Labour vote that brought him to power. So he already was on, I would say, an unstable, if not altogether rickety foundation, even coming into power with a lot to prove. And the word we've all used is deliver, a lot to deliver on, and it's that perception of not delivering.